We all know the story. We know that the reason that Romeo and Juliet can't be together is because the Montagues and Capulets hate each other. It's a forbidden union. We all know that. We know that's true before we even start the play. But is that actually true? I mean, it's definitely true that the Montagues and Capulets hate each other, but is that the driving force of this tragedy? The reason that our star-crossed lovers can't be together? Do the Montagues and Capulets actually keep them apart? I mean, Romeo is in love with Rosaline at the start of the play, and Rosaline is a Capulet. Everybody knows about it, and nobody argues with Romeo that his love for Rosaline is doomed because she's a Capulet. No, it's doomed because Rosaline isn't into the sad poet vibes that Romeo brings so aggressively to every interaction. Like, the pathetic Romeo only agrees to attend that fateful party where he meets Juliet because Rosaline is gonna be there, and she's there because she's a Capulet. His bros persuade him to attend the party so that he can compare her to other women who are at the Capulet party. No one is saying, Romeo, dude, find somebody who isn't a Capulet. They want Romeo to forget Rosaline because he's sad all the time, not because she's a Capulet. And Juliet's parents never tell her explicitly that she can't date a Montague. In fact, Daddy Capulet only says nice things about Romeo. He says, to say truth, Verona brags of him to be a virtuous and well-governed youth. Kinda sounds like the type of kid he'd want his daughter to date. Juliet's parents become very angry with Juliet because she won't give Paris a chance. They don't even know that she's in a flirtation with Romeo. And low-key, I don't think that her parents very much like the idea of Paris either, but he's related to the prince, so he's difficult to reject. So, I think it's possible to argue that the ancient feud isn't actually the primary provocation of this tragedy. It's possible to argue that it's more complicated than that, and if the feud between the Montagues and Capulets isn't fully responsible for the tragedy, then what is? Well, this is one way that feminist criticism has helped open up and enrich conversations about the play. Shakespeare is never simple, and that whole equation about the two families keeping the kids apart, it's too simple. If we look at the play from a feminist perspective, we might find that it is Romeo and Juliet's failure to successfully rebel against or transcend the gender norms of their society that produces this tragedy. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the role of gender in Romeo and Juliet. And if that sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. And with that out of the way, let's talk about those gender norms. I think it's pretty clear that Romeo and Juliet are treated very differently in Verona, and therefore inhabit two different versions of the city. Like, the first thing that we learn about Romeo is that nobody even knows where he is. Benvolio saw him an hour ago, but Romeo wanted to be alone, so we learn that Romeo has the freedom to be alone and just go off into the woods by himself. Throughout the play, he'll either be in public spaces, or he'll be walking off on his own like this. We'll never see him in his house or talking to his parents. And obviously, Juliet has a very different experience of Verona. Like, the first time we meet her, she's in her home, talking to her parents. In fact, other than a brief excursion to a church in Act 2, she resides exclusively in Capulet-controlled spaces, either the Capulet house or the Capulet tomb. Romeo's parents are concerned, sure, but they're also absent. They leave the stage as soon as he enters in Act 1. And Juliet seems to have whatever the opposite of that is. Her parents don't just stay around, they're continuously calling for her and interrupting her privacy. And also, there seems to be two of each parent. Juliet has both a mother and a nurse serving a maternal role, and then she has both her father and Paris negotiating the transfer of paternal control over her body. Romeo's parents leave him alone. Juliet's parents call for reinforcements. Notably, we hear about both Romeo and Juliet before we see either of them, which tells us that they exist first within networks of relationships rather than as private individuals. Romeo can't go for a sad walk without people being concerned, and Juliet can't turn 14 without people being concerned. And so, we should look at the ways that that concern manifests because it's different for Romeo than it is for Juliet, and that difference can be explained by their position in the social hierarchy, a social hierarchy that treats men and women differently. The people around Romeo want him to be more active, but the people around Juliet wish that she were more passive. Let's start with Romeo. Throughout the play, Romeo's friends try to call him back into the world of men. When Benvolio finds him in Act 1, he encourages Romeo to go out and flirt with other women. For Benvolio, it's not right that one woman is taking up all of Romeo's brain space. Benvolio tells Romeo to be ruled by him, by the community of men, and he tells Romeo he should give liberty unto thine eyes, examine other beauties. If Romeo wants to be one of the bros, he needs to be energetic rather than melancholic. He should be ruled by male friendship rather than women, and he should consider many women rather than obsess over one. Mercutio will continue this line of argument throughout the play, but he'll be more explicit about the role of sex and violence in this particular construction of masculinity. He'll tell Romeo to be rough with love, for example, and he's always making sexual puns. And it's not just Romeo's friends who are promoting this particular version of masculinity, it's embedded in the setting of the play. From the very first scene, masculinity is associated with violence. As the scholar Marianne Novy notes in Verona, there is a blood feud that calls on men to define their masculinity by violence. And Romeo needs to contort himself to fit into this social world, a world that requires men to be rough with love, to think about love in terms of conquest, because the world around him values violence and domination when it comes from a body that looks like his. And it actually seems like Romeo could fit into this world pretty easily. He can match Mercutio in bawdy wordplay, something that nobody else can do. He beats Tybalt in a sword fight, something that nobody else could do. Even Lord Capulet, his sworn enemy, thinks highly of him. Romeo seems built for success in this world with its expectations for masculinity, and yet he's sad. It doesn't work for him. Like, if he just decided he wanted to play this game of masculinity, the game that Verona wants him to play, he could win. He could be Lord Montague someday and rule over everything, be the manliest man. But the patriarchy hurts everybody, even those who seem to benefit from it. Romeo is not a happy guy, even though this world seems custom built for him. His desires are more complicated than the limited socially approved desires that the world expects from him, and his rebellion against those expectations has real consequences. Okay, so the norms of Verona want Romeo to adhere to the values of this masculine world, and value his male friendships, and be rough with love. And as for Juliet, I mean, the exact opposite is expected of her. First, she doesn't even have any friends. The closest thing that she has to a friend is her nurse, so she has no group of ladies offering her advice or coercing her into any behavior. She only has parental figures, which immediately puts her exclusively into a subordinate position. No one encourages her to perform dominance. They only want her to listen. And what they want to tell her is to think of marriage now. Marriage. When she's only 13. And this pressure doesn't even come exclusively from her parents. It comes from the state. Paris is a kinsman to the prince, and he's putting the pressure on their parents to put pressure on her. So Romeo's friends encourage him to look at many women, while Juliet's parents encourage her to look at only one. Romeo's friends worry that he is ruled too much by love, whereas Mommy and Daddy Capulet command Juliet to consider marriage before she's even thought about it. They want her to skip the dating part altogether and allow herself to just passively be courted for marriage by the man that they have picked out for her. Romeo's friends want him to talk more. When he says that he's going to go to the party and just hold the light and stand against the wall, Mercutio says, "If thou art done, we'll draw thee from the mire," which, like everything that Mercutio says, is obscured by a very clever and antiquated pun. All he's saying is that the boys will draw him out. They'll pull him out of his metaphoric swamp, his mire, and they'll get him to be more social. They're going to get him to talk more. Juliet's parents want the opposite for her. They want her to talk less. When asking her about Paris, Mama Capulet actually says to her, "Speak briefly. Can you like of Paris's love?" She's saying, don't talk much. Can you submit yourself to a suitor? Juliet has to be quiet and follow instructions. So femininity here is to be passive, to be ruled by the parents, and to consider marriage, not a date, a marriage, to a man she's barely met, while she's only 13 years old. Romeo's community pushes him away from monogamous love. Juliet's community pushes her towards it. Romeo's community wants him to be active, have agency, and be carefree. Juliet's community wants her to be passive, compliant, and allow herself to be treated as property. Obviously, these different experiences and different expectations for Romeo and Juliet result from a particular flavor of patriarchy, so we should briefly discuss that flavor. The prologue famously tells us that Verona has two households, both alike in dignity, and this calls our attention to the idea of a household. The household during this time functioned like its own economic unit. What I mean by that is that the household had its own internal hierarchies. Each household was like its own state. The head of the household, the father or husband, assumed a role similar to that of a king, and with that role, he controlled all the other members of the household. The scholar, Alison Findlay, tells us that the experiences of the household were significantly different for men and women. The master had absolute authority to govern his wife, children, and servants. And as part of that authority, he had to manage all the resources of his household. And one of those resources is his daughter. And in Romeo and Juliet, Daddy Capulet has, in Juliet, a valuable piece of property that he can exchange for political capital. As I've noted, Paris is related to the prince. Though Daddy Capulet will say that Juliet's consent to marriage is important during Act 1, as soon as she shows any signs of resistance, his tone changes to reflect his authoritarian position very quickly. In Act 3, Scene 5, he'll make this clear. "And you be mine. I'll give you to my friend. And you be not? Hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. For by my soul I'll ne'er acknowledge thee, nor what is mine shall never do thee good. I'll give you to my friend." So within this household, she either submits to her role as property, something that can just be given to a friend, or she must exist outside of the household altogether, die in the streets. This is just savage. And so these are the expectations our protagonists have to live with. Romeo has to act like a man by being rough with love and prove himself through promiscuity and violence. Juliet needs to act like a girl by being submissive and accept her role as property, something that can be exchanged between men to reinforce the male bonds of patriarchy. Moreover, and I haven't even mentioned this at all yet, but she can't be promiscuous at all. Her virginity plays an essential role in her value as a commodity. She has to be with the man that her father gives her to, and only the man that her father gives her to. These are the expectations that they live with, and these are the features of Verona that keep them apart, because as soon as Romeo and Juliet meet each other at the end of Act 1, they both abandon these gendered expectations, and it's this transgression that actually separates them from their communities and leads to their tragedy. So Romeo's community speaks to him about love in terms of domination, and Juliet's community speaks to her about love in terms of submission. Even though both of them show little signs of rebellion here and there, they both generally play by the rules in Act 1. When Romeo discusses Rosaline in the first scene of the play, he says that she'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow, and that she'll not stay the siege of loving terms. In both cases, he's thinking about his love for her in terms of an active and violent conquest. Even though his bros would rather him not be in love at all, he at least uses the approved language of conquest when he's discussing his love. And when Juliet is asked about Paris, she says, "I'll look to like, if looking liking move, but no more deep will I endart my eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly." Similar to Romeo, she's not exactly playing her role perfectly. She does use a masculine metaphor for her desire as a weapon that she can let fly, but this metaphor exists within the language of submission. She won't look anywhere other than the places that her parents give her consent. She's mostly playing the role. They both are. But then they meet, and with that meeting, the language that they both use to talk about love completely changes. And that's a little misleading. It doesn't completely change. Romeo still uses the language of war, but this time he's not trying to conquer the object of his love. He says stuff like, "Look thou but sweet, and I am proof against their enmity." If she likes him, then he is protected against his enemies. She's not a castle under siege anymore. She's a fortress that he can take refuge in. She's not something that can be conquered. She's just the opposite of that. She protects him. Even when he talks about her with violent imagery, the violence is directed at himself. He wishes to tear the word of his own name because it is an enemy to her. And he tells the friar that, "I have been feasting with mine enemy, where on a sudden one hath wounded me that's by me wounded." The wounds here are reciprocal. They're equal. They have wounded each other. This is not the language of domination or conquest. It's more like mutual defeat. Though it still uses the imagery of war, this isn't about control anymore. And the same is true for Juliet's language. She is no longer passive. Rather than wait around like a piece of property to be traded among land-owning men and exchanged one master for another, Juliet straight up proposes marriage to Romeo. She takes ownership of herself and gives herself away. And in her monologue in Act 3, Scene 2, she is overtly sexual. She's waiting for Romeo and she's excited for their amorous rites. There's nothing passive about it. She actively wants to be with Romeo. Her desire matters. And similar to Romeo's language, she uses metaphors that stress equality and reciprocal love. For example, she asks the knight to learn me how to lose a winning match played for a pair of stainless maidenhoods. She wants to lose a winning match, a match where both her and Romeo will lose their virginities. Her language values male and female virginity equally, and they will lose theirs together in a winning match. In that speech, Juliet articulates a desire for sexual pleasure that the play so far has only associated with masculinity, just as Romeo has adopted the submission that the play has so far only associated with femininity. So when Romeo is with Juliet, he no longer acts like a man, which is to say, he doesn't think about love in terms of sex and violence or conquest, and when Juliet is with Romeo, she no longer acts like a woman, which is to say, she is not passive or subordinate. But they still need to live in a world that expects those behaviors from them. This transformation in them, this active resistance through gender nonconformity, is an attempt to change the world. They want to transform and remake the world to better align with their new subjectivities. They want a new form of socially approved love. They want to change the nightingale into a lark. They want the world to change in order to accommodate their new form of love rather than the other way around. They're not going to change for the world. But of course, they cannot remake the world without consequences. Too many people are too invested in the gender norms of Verona, and these two exist first within those networks of relationships. Romeo has abandoned the world of men in order to be newly baptized under Juliet's balcony. Which, by the way, seems like a pretty solid visual metaphor for his subordination and her domination. Juliet above on the balcony and Romeo below in the orchard, but then he climbs up to her and they stand as equals. But this new version of Romeo, this new unmanly performance of love, it will inadvertently be responsible for the death of his friend Mercutio. By refusing to fight Tybalt and refusing to allow the expectation of violence to work through him, Romeo will feel responsible for Mercutio's death. As Romeo watches his friend die, he notably screams, "O sweet Juliet, thy beauty hath made me effeminate, and in my temper softened valor's steel." In this moment, he recognizes that his relationship with Juliet has taken him away from the world of men. He cannot become effeminate without consequences. And so, in Act 3, Scene 1, Romeo is called back into the world of men and kills Tybalt. He fails to transcend the gender expectations Verona has for him, and the result is exile. Similarly, Juliet's rebellion isn't simply an inspiring act of resistance. It also has real consequences. To quote again from Alison Findlay, "The daughter who has moved out of the role of gift to follow her own desires occupies an incongruous position in her father's household. Once married through her own choice, Juliet's sense of autonomy brings her into direct conflict with her father. Because she's given herself away, she stands in direct conflict with her father, who believes himself to be the owner of her body. When Juliet actively pursues her own desires and her own subjectivity, she loses every other connection in her life. She loses her father, her nurse, everybody who has ever cared for her. By not playing the game of daughter in the socially approved of ways, she sacrifices every other relationship in her life. Remember, she'll either be given to her father's friend or she'll die in the streets." Romeo's rebellion will physically isolate him from his community through his exile. Juliet's rebellion will emotionally isolate her from her community. They resisted the gendered expectations that the world had for them, and in doing so, they isolated themselves from their communities. And of course, they cannot survive on their own. We know how this story ends. That said, they do ultimately transform the world with their deaths. Verona at the end of this play is a different place because these two crazy youths loved each other and died together. Romeo's submission to Juliet and Juliet's refusal to play the compliant daughter both lead to the collapse of the household system and consolidate power in the state, represented by the prince. The gender norms of Verona depend upon the continued and repeated performance of those gender norms by every generation. Just as the ancient feud requires the younger generation of serving men to fight even as the aging patriarchs cannot do it themselves. Romeo and Juliet did not conform. They did not perform the gendered roles that were expected of them, and they could therefore not live in Verona. And their deaths will inspire reflection. There will be more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished. This play asks us to talk about it, to question our own complacency and compliance in the deep systemic forces that put restrictions on our behaviors and our desires. We need to, as the prince instructs us, keep talking about these gender norms and the impact that they have on our ability to love each other. And that's where I'm going to end this one. I'm going to take this argument further in the next video as I discuss the politics of love in Romeo and Juliet. Please subscribe to be notified when that video is published, and thank you for watching.